The child shouldn't have been there, not in that clearing, not alone. Not breathing in shallow, desperate pulls that barely stirred the frost on her lips. Gideon Pratt stood 3 FD from the small form curled against the base of the oak, his rifle loose in one hand, his breath forming clouds in the bitter air. He'd heard something while checking the fence line. Not an animal, something else. Something that made the back of his neck prickle with an instinct he hadn't felt in years. When he pushed through the snow-heavy branches, he found her, a Comanche child, maybe 8 years old. Her deer skin clothing was soaked through, her black hair matted with ice, her small hands tucked against her chest. She wasn't moving. But 3 years ago, Gideon had buried his own son in ground so frozen, he'd needed an axe to break the earth. He knew what a dead child looked like. This one was still fighting. The wind howled through the trees as Gideon dropped to one knee beside her. Her skin was the color of ash, her lips pale blue. He pulled off his heavy coat and wrapped it around her small frame. When he lifted her, she weighed almost nothing. Her head lolled against his shoulder, and for one terrible moment he thought he'd been wrong, that she was already gone. Then her fingers twitched, just once, just enough. Gideon turned and started the half-mile walk back to his cabin, his boots crunching through snow that came up past his knees. Every breath burned his lungs. The child's face was pressed against his chest, and he could feel the faint, irregular beat of her heart through the layers of clothing. He moved faster. The sky above was the color of steel, promising more snow before nightfall. His property sat at the edge of territory where white settlers rarely ventured anymore. Too many raids, too many bodies, too much bad blood. Gideon had stayed because he had nowhere else to go and nothing left to lose. But carrying a Comanche child toward his home changed that calculation in ways he hadn't yet let himself consider. His cabin appeared through the trees, small and weathered, smoke rising from the chimney. He kicked the door open and carried the girl inside, laying her on the floor near the fire. Her breathing was so shallow, he had to watch her chest carefully to see it rise and fall. He stripped away her wet clothing with quick, efficient movements, wrapping her in wool blankets from his bed. Her skin was ice against his palms. He'd seen frostbite before. Her fingers and toes were dark at the tips. She might lose some. She might lose all of them. She might not wake up at all. Gideon built up the fire until the cabin was sweltering, then knelt beside her and began rubbing her limbs through the blankets, trying to force warmth back into her body. Her eyelids fluttered, but didn't open. Once she made a sound, a small whimper that cut through him like a blade. He thought of his son, of the fever that had taken him, of how helpless he'd felt watching the light fade from those small eyes. This child wouldn't die in his cabin, not if he could prevent it. But even as he worked, unfolded even as he addleness notch color, TIMES, before LOWLY returned to her cheeks, another thought crept into his mind like frost spreading across glass. Someone was looking for her, someone who would follow her tracks through the snow, someone who would see those tracks lead directly to his door. Gideon glanced toward the window. Darkness was falling fast, the storm was coming, and somewhere out there in the frozen wilderness, warriors were searching for a child who now lay unconscious in the home of a white man. He looked back at the girl. Her breathing was stronger now, more regular. She might survive the night. The question was whether he would survive the morning, because when the sun rose and the Comanche came, and they would come, every moment of mercy he'd shown would look like something else entirely. It would look like theft. It would look like harm, and there would be no words he could speak, no gesture he could make that would bridge the gap between intention and perception. Not in time, not before they decided his fate. The girl's fingers curled slightly against the blanket, and Gideon felt the weight of the choice he'd already made. He couldn't undo it, wouldn't even if he could, but the cost was coming. He could feel it in his bones, and it would arrive with the dawn. The night stretched like a wound that wouldn't close. Gideon sat beside the fire, watching the girl breathe. Every few minutes, he checked her pulse at her wrist, her neck, counting the beats against the seconds. Too fast meant fever. Too slow meant she was slipping away. He kept the rhythm steady in his mind, a desperate math that might keep death at bay for one more hour. Outside, the wind screamed against the cabin walls. Snow piled against the window until he could barely see through the glass. The storm had come as promised, turning the world into white chaos. No one could track through this. Not tonight. But when it passed, when the sky cleared and the sun rose, every footprint he'd made would be preserved in fresh powder like evidence carved in stone. The girl stirred around midnight. A small sound escaped her lips, something that might have been a word in a language Gideon didn't speak. Her eyelids fluttered but didn't open. He dampened a cloth and pressed it to her forehead. Her skin was hot now. Too hot, the pendulum swinging from freeze to fever. He'd seen this before, the body fighting itself, trying to recover from cold so severe it damaged something deep inside. She needed medicine he didn't have. She needed help he couldn't give. All he could do was keep her warm, keep her breathing, and hope her young body was strong enough to win the battle on its own. Around 3:00 in the morning, Gideon made coffee. He didn't drink and stared at the door. His rifle leaned against the wall within reach. Not that it would matter. If warriors came in numbers, one rifle wouldn't save him. He'd be dead before he could reload. The smart thing would be to take the girl outside right now. Leave her wrapped in blankets near the tree line where she'd be found quickly. Distance himself from the situation entirely. Let them think she'd crawled there on her own. But she'd die in minutes in this cold. And Gideon had already chosen his path when he'd lifted her from the snow. There was no walking it back now. The girl's eyes opened just before dawn, not all the way, just narrow slits that caught the firelight and reflected it back like chips of obsidian. She looked at Gideon without recognition, without fear, without anything he could read. Then her gaze moved slowly around the cabin, taking in the rough walls, the simple furniture, the rifle. When her eyes returned to him, something changed in her expression, not understanding exactly, but awareness. She knew she wasn't home. She knew she was with a stranger. Her small hand moved beneath the blankets, searching for something that wasn't there. A weapon maybe, or a talisman, something familiar in a world that had become impossible overnight. Gideon held up his empty hands, palms out, the universal gesture of peace. The girl watched him with eyes far older than 8 years should hold. She didn't speak. Neither did he. What words could bridge this gap? What language could explain the choice he'd made and the danger it had created for both of them? Outside, the storm was dying. The wind's scream had dropped to a moan, then to silence. Through the window, the first gray light of dawn began to seep across the snow. The girl saw it too. Her body went rigid beneath the blankets, and her breathing quickened. She tried to sit up, gasped at the pain in her limbs, and fell back. Then she did something that made Gideon's blood turn cold. She looked toward the door and whispered one word. A name, he thought, repeated twice, soft and urgent. A prayer or a warning. And somewhere in the distance, muffled by snow and walls and the last remnants of storm, came the sound Gideon had been dreading since the moment he'd found her. Horses, multiple horses, moving fast through the powder, closing the distance. They were here. Gideon moved without thinking. He scooped the girl from the floor, blankets and all, and kicked open the back door. The cold hit like a fist, but he was already running through knee-deep snow toward the barn. The cabin was a trap with one door, and windows too small to escape through. The barn had space, had exits on 3 sides, had places to take cover if everything went wrong. The girl made a small sound against his chest, confused or frightened, but didn't struggle. She was too weak for that. Behind them, the sound of horses grew louder, coming from the east, where the main trail cut through the property. Gideon crashed through the barn door and set the girl down in a pile of hay near the back wall. She looked up at him with those black eyes that seemed to see straight through to his bones. He held up one hand, the gesture clear even across language. "Stay here, don't move." She didn't respond, just pulled the blankets tighter and watched him. Gideon grabbed a pitchfork from the wall, more for appearance than use, and moved to the front of the barn. Through the gap in the door, he could see them now, 6 riders emerging from the tree-like shadows given form. They moved in formation, practiced and precise, spreading out as they approached. War horses, not pack animals. Men dressed for hunting, for tracking, for violence if it came to that. The lead rider was broad, shouldered with streaks of gray in his long hair. His face marked with scars that spoke of battles survived. He raised one hand, and the group stopped 50 feet from the barn, forming a semicircle that blocked every visible exit. The barn was surrounded. Gideon's breathing came hard and fast, fogging the cold air. This was the moment the girl had feared, the moment he'd known was coming since he'd wrapped his coat around her in the snow. They sat there on their horses, perfectly still, waiting for what? Gideon didn't know. For him to show himself, for him to harm their child, for him to make the first wrong move so they could justify what came next. He could feel their eyes on the barn, could sense the tension in their stillness. One of the younger warriors had a bow already strung, arrow notched, but not drawn. Another had a rifle across his lap, hands loose but ready. They weren't here for conversation. They were here for their child, and nothing else mattered. Gideon looked back at the girl. She'd pushed herself up against the wall, her small face pale but alert. She was staring at the door, and he could see her lips moving, forming words too quiet to hear. Then she did something that changed everything. She tried to stand. Her legs buckled immediately, sending her back to the hay with a gasp of pain. But she tried again, gritting her teeth, forcing her frozen limbs to obey. She was trying to go to them, trying to show herself, trying to prove she was alive. Gideon moved toward her, hands out, meaning only to steady her. But from outside came a shout, sharp and commanding, the sound of horses shifting, weapons being readied. They'd seen movement through the gaps in the barn walls. They'd seen him approach the child, and in that moment, without words or weapons or any chance to explain, everything he'd done to save her life looked like something else entirely. The lead warrior dismounted in one smooth motion. 4 others followed. They were coming in, and Gideon was standing between them and their daughter with a pitchfork in his hands, and no way to make them understand that he was the reason she was still breathing. The barn door exploded inward with a force that sent splinters flying. The lead warrior entered first, moving with the controlled violence of a man who'd done this 100 times before. His eyes swept the interior in one swift scan, identifying threats, exits, weapons. They locked onto Gideon, then onto the pitchfork in his hands, then onto the small figure behind him in the hay. The warrior's face didn't change, but something in his posture shifted. A tightening of the shoulders, a subtle repositioning of weight. He was preparing to kill. Gideon dropped the pitchfork. The metal hit the dirt floor with a dull thud that seemed impossibly loud in the frozen silence. He raised his hands slowly, palms out, fingers spread. The universal language of surrender, but surrender wasn't what the warrior saw. He saw a white man standing between him and his child. He saw blankets that might hide injuries. He saw a situation that had only one logical explanation, and that explanation ended with Gideon's blood in the snow. The girl's voice cut through the tension like a knife, small and weak, but urgent. She spoke rapidly in her language, words tumbling over each other as she pushed herself forward in the hay. The lead warrior's head snapped toward her. For the first time, emotion cracked through his stone expression. Relief, raw and immediate. He moved toward her, 2 long strides that closed the distance. Then he stopped. She was wrapped in a white man's blankets. Her wet clothes hung on a nail near the wall, steaming in the barn's relative warmth. She'd been undressed, changed, handled. The warrior's hand moved to the knife at his belt. Behind him, the other warriors spread out, forming a wall between Gideon and the only exit. One of them had his bow drawn now, arrow aimed at Gideon's chest. The distance was maybe 15 ft. At that range, he wouldn't miss. The girl spoke again, louder this time, her voice breaking with effort. She pointed at Gideon with one small hand, then at herself, then made a gesture Gideon didn't understand. The lead warrior looked at her, then at Gideon, then back at her. Something passed between them, a question asked and answered. But whatever she'd said hadn't changed the mathematics of the situation. Gideon was still a white man who'd taken a Comanche child, who'd removed her clothing, who'd kept her overnight in his barn. No matter her words, no matter his intentions, the facts arranged themselves into a story that had only one ending. The warrior spoke for the first time. His voice was deep and controlled, each word measured like a blade being drawn. Gideon didn't understand the language, but he understood the tone. It was a question, or maybe an accusation. Maybe both. Gideon pointed at the girl, then at the ground, making a gesture like something falling. He pointed at the fire visible through the barn door, then wrapped his arms around himself and shivered. He was trying to mime the story, girl in snow brought to warmth, saved from cold. The warrior watched without expression. Then he turned to one of the younger men and spoke rapidly. The younger warrior moved forward, circling wide to avoid getting between the archer and Gideon. He knelt beside the girl, checking her carefully. His hands moved over her limbs with practiced efficiency, the touch of someone who'd assessed injuries before. He looked at her fingers and toes, darkened by frostbite, but not black, still salvageable. He examined her face, her neck, searching for marks that weren't there. Then he looked up at the lead warrior and spoke. 3 words, calm and factual. The lead warrior's eyes closed for just a moment. When they opened, some of the killing tension had drained from his shoulders, but not all of it. Not nearly all of it, because the girl might be alive, might be unharmed. But that didn't erase the fundamental problem Gideon had taken her, and now they had to decide what price that choice carried. The girl spoke again. This time she wasn't looking at her father. She was looking at Gideon. Her small hand reached out from the blankets, fingers stretching toward him across the space between them. She said something. 2 words repeated twice with an inflection that sounded almost like gratitude. The lead warrior's jaw tightened. He moved forward and carefully gathered the girl into his arms. She wrapped her thin arms around his neck and buried her face against his shoulder. For a moment, the warrior's eyes closed, and Gideon saw something he recognized in the lines of that scarred face. The terror of almost losing a child, the relief of holding them again. The warrior held her like she was made of glass, like if he squeezed too hard, she might shatter. Then he turned those dark eyes back to Gideon, and the gratitude Gideon had dared to hope for wasn't there. Only calculation, only caution. The warrior carried the girl toward the door, speaking quietly to her in their language. The other warriors began to pull back, maintaining their formation, but creating space for their leader to exit. This should have been the end of it. They had what they came for. They could leave, but one of the younger warriors said something sharp and pointed at the ground near where the girl had been lying. The lead warrior stopped, turned, looked. There in the hay was a small leather pouch, half hidden by the blankets. The warrior shifted the girl in his arms and gestured with his chin. The younger man picked up the pouch and opened it carefully. He